When looking at the legacy of colonial rule in India, it is easy to point to the massive railway networks, modern schools, and courts of law, and assume these were generous gifts of development. But take a look at this chart showing global industrial output in the early 18th century. Before colonial rule, India produced roughly 25% of the world's manufactured goods. Its economy was anchored by a vast, decentralized network of self-sufficient villages, managing their own affairs. The British East India Company arrived to buy into this wealth. Over time, they realized that controlling the territory directly was far more profitable than simply trading with it. To secure that control, the company began to dismantle the flexible local village councils. In their place, they installed a rigid, centralized bureaucracy, carving the subcontinent into fixed administrative districts. The company needed to replace a localized, self-sustaining economy with a highly efficient, controllable system designed entirely to siphon wealth outward. At the head of these new administrative districts were British collectors. Their primary job was to enforce exorbitantly high taxes on farmers, demanding those taxes be paid strictly in cash, regardless of the harvest. When monsoons failed, farmers who previously relied on local grain reserves had to sell their tools, cattle, and seeds just to pay the British. Policies like this turned natural droughts into human-made catastrophes, such as the Bengal famine of 1770, which killed roughly 10 million people. Decades later, an Indian thinker named Dadabhai Naoroji began analyzing these economic patterns. He realized that the deepening poverty across the subcontinent was a deliberate, engineered outcome. Naoroji mapped out the drain of wealth. In this flowchart, a third of Indian tax revenues act like a conveyor belt, funding British official salaries and overseas military campaigns, while debt interest flows right back to Indian taxpayers. While agriculture collapsed, Indian manufacturing was actively smothered. The British flooded local markets with cheap, machine-made textiles from England, while simultaneously taxing Indian weavers so heavily that millions lost their livelihoods and were forced back into farming. The damage extended to metallurgy. The famous VIII steel industry, which produced incredibly strong, flexible blades, was suffocated. The British restricted access to the forests needed for charcoal, taxed local furnaces, and pushed their own imported European steel into the market. By systematically crushing local manufacturing and bleeding the agricultural sector, the British successfully inverted India's economy. The country dropped from producing a quarter of the world's industrial output to just 2%, transforming from a global manufacturing powerhouse into a captive consumer market. Controlling an economy of this size required administrators. In 1835, a British official named Thomas Macaulay introduced a new education policy. His explicit goal was to replace traditional Indian learning with a strictly Western curriculum taught entirely in English. The colonial government pulled funding from thousands of local gurukuls and madrasas, the traditional primary schools. They wanted to mass-produce a specific class of English-educated Indians who could serve as clerks and interpreters to help run the empire. At the same time, other British scholars and archaeologists meticulously studied, translated, and excavated India's ancient texts and temples. However, this preservation came with a clear sense of ownership, as many of the most valuable artifacts were shipped off to be displayed in British museums. The physical occupation of the land required a systemic effort to reshape the culture. The British recognized that to maintain control over millions of people, they needed Indians to participate in the day-to-day administration of their own colonization. A system designed to extract maximum resources with minimum return is inherently unstable. Across the subcontinent, decades of heavy taxation, land loss, and cultural interference pushed different social classes to their breaking points. Indigenous communities were among the first to react. When the British expanded into the forests to extract timber and brought in outside tax collectors, tribal groups like the Santhals fought back fiercely against the displacement and exploitation. In the agricultural plains, peasant farmers reached a similar limit. During the Indigo Rebellion, thousands of farmers violently rejected the oppressive debt systems that forced them to grow blue dye for European markets instead of food for their own families. By 1857, the mounting frustration reached the colonial military itself. The immediate trigger was the introduction of the new Enfield rifle. Rumors spread that its cartridges were greased with cow and pig fat, deeply offending the religious convictions of Hindu and Muslim soldiers, known as sepoys. The mutiny over the cartridges quickly expanded into a widespread rebellion. Displaced royals like Rani Lakshmi Bai joined forces with angry soldiers, peasants, and local leaders, uniting diverse groups against a common enemy in intense, direct combat. The British military response was ruthless. By mid-1858, they poured in reinforcements and crushed the uprising, leaving major rebel centers heavily damaged and imposing a severe toll on the population. The 1857 uprising was defeated on the battlefield, but it proved that the colonial extraction model had pushed the population to an absolute limit. The scale of the resistance forced the British to completely restructure how they held the subcontinent. Following the uprising, the British government abolished the East India Company. Administration of the subcontinent was transferred directly to the British Crown, placing India formally under the rule of Queen Victoria. Under the Crown, the British rapidly expanded the infrastructure we saw at the start of this story. They built massive bridges, deep-water ports, and thousands of miles of railway track, all designed to move troops quickly and transport raw materials to the coast for export. But these systems functioned in ways the British hadn't planned. The railways, intended for resource extraction, also carried ideas across provincial borders. The English language, introduced to train administrators, became a shared medium for geographically divided leaders to debate and organize. Over the following decades, this connectivity and exposure to global political ideas fostered a new class of Indian thinkers. They began to use the very bureaucracy and legal systems the British installed to argue for their own rights and self-governance. The colonial era systematically dismantled India's traditional economy, shifting an estimated 380 trillion rupees to Britain by the start of the 20th century. While this extraction shattered traditional life, the infrastructure of the empire inadvertently provided the connectivity and educational framework that the next generation of Indians would use to organize a nationwide movement for independence.